On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to share how Bobbi Althoff got Drake on her 4-month-old podcast. This is from last year. Bobbi Althoff got Drake on her 4-month-old podcast, turning it to the #1 podcast in the world. This is from 11 months ago to the date. 11 months ago, I heard this story. I was so inspired by it that I turned it into a newsletter. That newsletter got a lot of great feedback. So then I turned that into a LinkedIn post, and that LinkedIn post became my best performing LinkedIn post by far, up until recently when my videos started going viral on LinkedIn, because LinkedIn is now prioritizing video. But this story about Drake, it is a story about playing to win. The takeaway that I got from this story was that most people think playing to win is about how hard you're willing to work. Working hard is important. But really, playing to win is about the risks you're willing to take. It's about the risks you are willing to take. That is what I got from this story. If you haven't seen the podcast, I don't know if it's still up, but it was super viral. You probably saw it at one point. Bobbi Althoff, she's super awkward. She interviews Drake in bed. It's really funny. You can probably find a mirror of it on YouTube. People are constantly reposting it on YouTube. There's all this beef between Bobbi Althoff and Drake. Bobbi Althoff and her husband divorced. A few months after this podcast, Dave Portnoy asked Bobbi to her face if she did anything under the covers with Drake, and she said no. And honestly, if she did, it was probably after this occurred, because I know lots of different stories like this. This is the introduction, the underdog story. In only 4 months, TikToker Bobbi Althoff, she went from no podcast, no industry connections, mid-level influencer to moms. That's crazy. A year ago, very few people knew her, and she was a mid-level influencer to moms. And now she's like very famous. 2, #1 podcast in the world. Now it's down to number 10. It was at #1 in 4 months. #1 podcast in the world. Signed by the most prominent talent agency on the planet, William Morris Endeavor. Doing podcasts with A-listers. Influencer to everybody, getting recognized everywhere. And here is exactly how she does it. I love this story. #1, she wants to start a podcast and get celebrities on it right away. Since she has very little distribution for the podcast and she's not famous, getting real famous people is not easy. She has some Instagram followers, she has TikTok followers, but she's not really famous, and she wants to use A-listers, real famous people. So she puts up a TikTok saying that she will give anybody who successfully connects her with a celebrity $300. So she's willing to give $300 to anybody who connects her with a celebrity. And then she gets connected with comedian Rick Glassman. So the person who connects her with Rick Glassman gets $300. She talks to Rick Glassman, and Rick Glassman agrees to do the podcast for free. He thinks the idea is funny. He thinks Bobbi Althoff is charming. He agrees to do the podcast for free. So Bobbi Althoff travels to Rick Glassman, hoping that he will not flake on the podcast. And he doesn't. And the interview goes super well, and it's funny. And in the comments section of it, somebody says she should next interview comedian Funny Marco. So she screenshots this comment of somebody saying that she should interview Funny Marco, who's also a comedian, screenshots the comment, and then puts it on her Instagram story and tags Funny Marco. And she writes, @Funny Marco, if you want to make this person $300, the commenter, if you want to make the commenter $300, come onto my podcast. So Funny Marco agrees to do it for free. She gives the person $300, the commenter $300. And again, she's hoping that Funny Marco is not going to flake, and she travels to him. And he doesn't flake, and the interview is very funny. And now here's where it takes a crazy turn. Drake likes the Funny Marco interview and follows Bobbi. And Bobbi takes her shot. She DMs Drake and she says, "When are you going to come on the podcast?" And to her surprise, Drake responds, he says he's down and sends his tour schedule. I think a lot of people here, they might be nervous to move on such an opportunity, and Bobbi is playing to win. She realizes that she needs to strike now before the opportunity evaporates. I think, first of all, a lot of people wouldn't believe, they'd be in shock that Drake said yes. And then they'd be a bit nervous capitalizing on it. Scared of money don't make no money. But that's a real thing. People self-sabotage all the time. And I really appreciate that Bobbi didn't. She realizes that she needs to strike now before the opportunity evaporates, and she gets her friend to help her film. So 2 days after sending the DM to Drake, she flies to Memphis, takes a flight, hoping that he's not going to flake, hoping that this is gonna happen, takes a flight with her friend. Drake doesn't flake. They shoot this hilarious podcast from Drake's bed. She releases a trailer for the podcast. It goes viral on TikTok. It's 30 million views. At this point, William Morris Endeavor reaches out when this happens and then signs Bobbi. So Bobbi gets signed to William Morris Endeavor before the podcast is put up. Then Bobbi puts up the Drake podcast on YouTube. It goes very viral, quickly gets 10 million views, briefly boosts Bobbi's podcast to the #1 podcast in the world 4 months after it was started. Then she goes on to get Mark Cuban, Lil Yachty, Tyga. And with each of these people, she acts with urgency. She never knows if they're going to flake or not. And again, my takeaway is most people think playing to win is about how hard you're willing to work. It's not. Playing to win is actually about the risks you're willing to take. Working hard is super important, but oftentimes you need to work hard for a prolonged period, and that's also a risk. I actually think it's pretty easy to be successful if you're just willing to stick with something for years, but that is a risk because you are turning down lots of other opportunities. You are saying no to lots of other opportunities. The most surefire way, just made a podcast about this, the most surefire way to get what you want, to hit your goals, is to just be willing to stick with something for years. I believe that in my heart. That is why when I was plateauing last year and I thought every day about giving up on social media, this was summer last year, 2023. I thought every day about giving up on social media and I didn't. I said, I'm going to figure it out. It always takes longer than you think. This happens with lots of other people. I'm going to figure it out. And I stuck with it. But that was a risk, or at least it felt like a risk at the time. A lot of people don't believe this story with Bobbi Althoff and Drake. One of my very close friends, his name is Brett Cohen. He's head of events at Forbes, executive director of events and partnerships at Forbes. Very close friend. I met him, I think in 2011 or 2010. We were both interning at WABC, New York City's local ABC station. And at the time, I think, he was, how old was he at the time? He was 17 at the time. He had no industry connections. He had a podcast on Blog Talk Radio. He didn't realize that podcasts were going to be huge and he didn't stick with it. It's hilarious. So actually, I had him on my podcast on episode 62 of this show. Forbes executive director reveals how he got Kim Kardashian on his podcast at 16 years old. So he was 16. He was getting Kim Kardashian, Paris Hilton, Jimmy Fallon, huge A-listers on his podcast when he was between being 16 years old and 17 years old. And he would do all these tricks to get them on. He would try to book famous guests when they were actively, this is so smart. He would look for famous guests who are actively promoting something, like a book or a new product, and they're more likely to do press during these periods, so he would reach out to them. Or he would reach out to publicists for their side hustles, because these A-listers are doing like so many different things, so he would reach out to publicists for like one of their less important things, so the publicist isn't as big. So he wouldn't contact the main agency. He always made his podcast seem like an opportunity for them. And since it was harder to get stats on podcasts back then, a lot of people would say yes. And he was just very confident about how the show was huge. And it wasn't. He would use Twitter when Twitter was new. So he actually got Jimmy Fallon through Twitter. And he just kept on messaging Jimmy Fallon saying, come on my podcast, come on my podcast. Brett tells the story so well on the episode 62 of this show. Number one, though, when big people are trying to promote their own projects, they're so much more likely to do press with you if you have maybe a video channel or a podcast yourself or a newsletter. Like he got Kim Kardashian because Kim Kardashian had a workout DVD promotion. And so she needed to do a certain amount of press to fulfill her obligations for the DVD promo. But it's stories like these, and I know so many different stories like these. I have stories like these myself, and that's why I believe that Bobbi Althoff's story is true. That's why I believe that stuff like this actually happens, because I see it from my friends, I see it from myself, and I know these things are possible. Crazier things have happened. This story is very in line from what I have personally seen in terms of how the media works. So I really believe this Bobbi Althoff story was a reminder to myself, play to win. The one caveat with playing to win and like taking big risks is you don't want to take a risk that's going to make it so you can't keep on going. Ultimately, you want to be able to keep trying and trying and trying and trying, because I just believe nobody's so dumb that they won't eventually figure it out. So you want to be able to keep going and going and going. So you don't want to take a risk that's going to completely F you. You don't want to bet at all. You don't want to bet the farm on something. Bobbi Althoff didn't bet the farm on this, but she did take risks that probably made her uncomfortable and that would make lots of other people uncomfortable. So I'm going to end this with the lesson that I got. Most people think playing to win is about how hard you're willing to work. Playing to win is actually about the risks you're willing to take. I love this story. I shared it before, and I'm so happy to be able to share it again. This is episode 374 of my daily show. I do this thing every day, 7 days a week. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Tomorrow I will have more digital marketing stories and hacks for you, and I will talk to you again then. I will talk to you again tomorrow. Bye now.